Raid Finder guide for the second part of Throne of Thunder, the Forgotten Depths. I will be focusing primarily upon the tanking aspects of these fights, but I will mention any other important details for you healers and DPS out there as well. The first boss in the Forgotten Depths is a giant turtle named Tortos. This is a fairly simple and straightforward fight to tank. One tank will need to, of course, pick up the main boss, Tortos, and the other tank will be running around picking up vampiric cave bats that will be dropping down throughout the fight. I'll talk more about the bats in a moment, but for right now, I'll just go over the couple things you need to know for Tortos. Tortos has a very wide hitbox, so you don't have to worry too much about where you're standing in order to be able to melee him. He does not move, but you do have to stay within his range. Now, one of the first things you probably will notice when you first even walk into the room is a small special action button called Kick Shell. This is important to interrupt a very high damaging AoE ability he has, but I'll talk a bit more on that in a moment. It's not something that tanks really have to worry about. Tortos has three main abilities that the tank needs to pay attention for. The first ability is a Snapping Bite, which is simply a small spike in damage that you simply have to be prepared for. The second ability is a Quake Stomp, which will be a brief stun on everyone in the raid, and will hit everyone in the raid for 30% of their maximum health. Again, this isn't really avoidable, this is something that healers need to pay attention to more than tanks. But it is a good idea to have some sort of damage mitigating cooldown up, just to help the healers out. The third ability that he has is that he causes stalactites to fall from the ceiling. You can tell where they're going to land by the small blue swirls on the ground. Simply don't stand in them. One important thing to note is that more stalagmites will fall directly following one of his Quake Stomps, so you'll have to move more during that time. This is one of the few fights where the main tank actually has an easier time than the off tank. The off tank will be picking up loads of bats that will be flying down throughout the fight. It's important that they never attack any melee, as not only do they hit really hard, but when they attack anyone with less than 550,000 HP, they begin healing 10 times the damage that they deal. Now, the bats can be slightly problematic to pick up. The best advice I can give is get an area of effect attack, such as Death and Decay, Consecration, or be channeling Spinning Crane Kick as soon as they land, or be outright spamming any AoE abilities as soon as they come down. As long as you pick them up quickly, they're not too big of an issue. There's no real special trick for tanking the bats, you simply have to be ready and pick them up as quickly as you can. And now for the final ability that Tortos has. He has an ability called Furious Sand Breath, which on 10 man will wipe you incredibly quickly if he gets it off. In Raid Finder it is survivable, but it still hurts. Throughout the fight, Tortos will be summoning three small turtles that basically just spin around and bounce all over the entire map. Melee needs to stay away from these and let the range deal with them, because if they touch you, they punch you into the air. However, it is important to kill these turtles as quickly as possible, as once dead, if you are within a few yards of them, your special action button, Kick Shell, becomes active. This does exactly what it says it does. Whenever you use it, it kicks the turtle shell in whatever direction you are facing. When the boss begins casting Furious Sand Breath, kicking a shell at him is the only way to interrupt him. The shell also causes a debuff, causing the boss to take 25% bonus damage, which can speed up the fight. Just be careful not to use up all of your shells. Near the end of the fight, he reaches a point where he starts spamming summoning the turtles, and you need to stop killing the turtles and focus simply on burning him down. And this sums up killing Tortos, the first boss in the Forgotten Depths. The second boss in the Forgotten Depths is a Hydra named Megara. Now, Megara has three different types of heads that you'll have to deal with. A poison head, a frozen head, and a flame head. When the fight first starts, one tank will pick up the poison head, or the green head, and the other tank will pick up the frozen head, or the blue head. These will be the only two heads active at the start of the fight. For the most part, DPS will pretty much ignore the blue head. It only needs to be tanked, not DPS'd. Each head only really has one primary ability that the tanks in general have to worry about. These abilities are frontal cone breath attacks. This means, of course, the tank always needs to make sure that the heads are facing away from the raid. The green head has a breath called Wrought Armor, which inflicts a decent amount of damage and causes the tank to take an increased amount of damage for 45 seconds, and this will stack. The frozen head has a breath called Arctic Freeze, which will deal a decent amount of damage and cause a stacking debuff. This debuff does nothing by itself unless it reaches 5 stacks. If it reaches 5 stacks, it will stun the tank for 15 seconds. This is very unpleasant if it happens, but you should never have to worry about it, as there will be tank switches long before this happens. Now, each individual head doesn't really have a lot of HP, and thus the heads will die fairly quickly. Once the first head dies, which would be the green head, the other head will become briefly unattackable, and Megira will begin casting an ability called Rampage. You can think of this as simply a large AoE that just must be healed through. Right as Megira starts casting Rampage, a new head will rise up. This will be the red head. The heads do not actually attack during the course of Rampage, and thus you only need to worry about the AoE damage. The red head, like the other two heads, needs to be faced away from the group, and it casts a frontal breath attack called Ignite Flesh. This is a debuff that ticks for a decent amount of damage, and this effect will stack. Essentially, the way this fight works is every time a head is killed, that head will go down and no longer be able to be attacked. And the head that was not present will then rise back up. As the first head you kill is green, the red head will rise up after you kill the green. Once you kill the red, the green will come back up. The DPS will simply swap between killing the green head first, then the red, then the green, and so on and so forth until Megira is dead. You need to kill around 7 heads for Megira to finally bite it. One important thing to note is that every time you kill a head, the heads gain an increased haste buff. This means that throughout the fight, the damage the tanks will be taking will be increased. Also interesting to note is that you don't actually kill the heads. Instead, once the head is destroyed, it simply rises back in the mists off in the distance. Now, when it's back there, it doesn't actually do anything for the most part, except during a rampage, where it will begin AoEing. This means that the AoE damage also ramps as the fight goes on. Megira has 2 other abilities that really don't affect the tanks too much, but DPS and healers should watch out for them. One of these is an ability called Acid Rain, which is basically just a big ball of poison shot from the green head that will hit the ground and explode for a lot of AoE damage. The farther you move away from it, the less damage you will take. The other ability is an ability called Cinders, which is a debuff placed on a player that, when dispelled, will leave a puddle of fire on the ground. Obviously, move away from the raid group when you get this debuff. Important to note that these two abilities are also cast by the heads that are off back in the fog. This means that they will come more frequently as the fight progresses, and they can come when the head in question, such as the Cinders from the fire head, or the Acid Rain from the poison head, are not actually the heads that are active at the moment. So the fight can be summed up pretty simply. One tank takes the green head first, the other tank takes the blue head first. When the green head dies, the tank that was tanking the green head moves to the blue head, and the tank that was tanking the blue head will move to the red head. Once the red head dies, the tank that was tanking the red head will move back to the blue head, and the tank that was tanking the blue head will move back to the green head. Rinse and repeat until Megira dies. Ji'Kun is the final boss in the Forgotten Depths. The primary method to avoiding a wipe is to have a very good nest team, which I will talk about in more detail a little bit later. The primary ability that the tanks have to watch out for coming from Ji'Kun is an ability called Talon Rake. This ability hits very hard and causes a debuff lasting for about a minute on the tank that increases the damage the tank will take from further Talon Rakes. In order to handle this mechanic, simply taunt off at 2 stacks of the ability. Ji'Kun does hit rather hard, so be prepared for sudden spikes, especially right after a Talon Rake. Ji'Kun also stacks a debuff on the tank that is simply a steady dot. This is simply extra damage that must be healed through, don't pay attention to it too much. Another ability Ji'Kun has is an ability called Caw. He will shoot a blast of sound at 3 players in the raid group that will then pulsate out once it hits them, damaging them and all players within 8 yards of them. To lessen the damage from this ability, stay spread out. Periodically, Ji'Kun will spit out a move called Feed Young. These are pulsing green piles of slime on the ground. Interestingly enough, you actually do want to stand in these, as if you stand in them long enough, you will absorb them and they will simply disappear. However, you will also get a debuff that increases the damage you take from further standing in slimes. Ideally, what you want is everyone in the raid periodically standing in the slimes to remove them, to spread it out evenly throughout the whole raid. One person cannot soak up all of the slimes. Periodically, Ji'Kun will also spam an ability called Quills. There is nothing you can do to avoid the damage from this ability, healers simply need to heal through it. Usually everyone is spread out through this fight to avoid damage from the Caw and from the slimes, but it is a good idea to stack during the Quills just to make things easier for the healers. Finally, Ji'Kun has an ability called Downdraft. While this ability by itself doesn't do any damage, it is rather annoying as it can blow players off the platform. When downdraft occurs, players need to run at Ji'Kun as fast as they can, using any sort of movement speed increase that they possibly have. This is especially true of tanks. Due to the timing of the encounter, occasionally Ji'Kun will use a Talon Rake directly after a downdraft. As Ji'Kun does not move around the platform, if the tanks are both out of range, Ji'Kun will hit the closest target to her. In the case of it being a DPS or a healer, they will most likely be one-shotted by this ability. So tanks, make sure to be very quick on your feet, and the instant Ji'Kun starts channeling downdraft, be using any sort of movement speed increases to start running right at her as soon as you can. The final thing about this encounter is you need a good nest team. Now the tanks do not have to worry about this. This requires 3 to 4 DPS and 1 healer. At the start of the fight, the nest team will be slightly away from everyone else and will jump down onto a lower platform that contains a lot of eggs. When the fight starts, Ji'Kun will start hatching these eggs. DPS need to kill them as quickly as possible and any adds that spawn from them. When the adds die, they will drop a feather. Clicking on this feather will grant you an ability in the form of a special action button called Daedalon Wings. This buff essentially allows you to fly. What you must do is whenever Ji'Kun starts hatching a group of eggs, you have to fly to the platform in which those eggs are on. The hatching platform is indicated by a large beam of red light surrounding the platform. Fly to the platform and slaughter the adds accordingly. As long as you handle all of these abilities correctly, you'll have downed Ji'Kun and wrapped up the forgotten depths of the Throne of Thunder. I hope this guide helps, and thanks for watching.